And that was how the obviously the law enforcement community sees the retention of data as being critical to what they're doing. But obviously there's another side of it in terms of privacy and so forth. And to pick up on that point, we have Senator Scott Ludlam, who I'll just invite up and he can take it away. So thank you.
Well, it's lovely to be here, and I'm a bit sorry that I've missed the presentation this morning. So I'll be flying a little bit blind as to what I'm responding to, but I'm presuming it's kind of reasonably familiar ground. That makes it significantly easier. My name's Scott Ludlam. I'm an Australian Greens Senator representing WA, and I'm also been our national communications spokesperson since 2007. And have seen a few different turns of the wheel, and actually what this feels most similar to, in my experience, for any of you who've been around this particular pitch for a while, is to the debate over the net filter that blew up in about 2008-9. And very similar arguments actually were levelled around being able to basically keep up with corruption, with national security issues, with child pornography, with organised crime, that we need to control this vast, unwieldy and effectively out of control communications platform to be able to continue doing law enforcement as usual. I don't have a particular beef against the corruption agencies, the agencies charged with protecting national security or law enforcement, specifically the AFP. I have a strong but respectful disagreement, not necessarily over the use of the technology, because I think everybody agrees and understands that it's extremely valuable, but the balance where it should be struck. And evidence from overseas, it's not as though we are the only ones on the planet debating issues of the way that these telecommunications platforms should serve the ends of these various agencies. The particular proposal for data retention has been around since about 2008, and I'm just realising actually I can talk about this stuff underwater. So somebody going to give me a wave? If I'm still going in like 3 hours, like somebody raise your hands. But maybe in 20 minutes or so, because I'll leave plenty of time for Q&A. I don't assume, by the way, that irrespective of what the Assistant Commissioner said this morning, I don't assume that you come to this debate necessarily with any element of agreement with where I'm coming from. So what I'm mostly going to talk about, give you some grounding in the reasons why we've taken such a strong position against this particular proposal over quite a long period of time, but also just sketch through the process as we see it, the legislative process, where it's come from and where it's heading, so that wherever you sit on the sort of spectrum of agreement, disagreement, or wherever, we'll at least have a bit of a shared idea of where this may or may not be going. But I'm actually really keen to get a sense of what the questions are. This first came to our attention in mid-2008. Ben Grubb from the Herald broke a story about how a handful of internet service providers had been dragged somewhat unwillingly, as it turned out, into a meeting with the Attorney General's Department. The AG's department, which has been driving this since at least then, wanted to know from industry, kind of on a confidential but without prejudice basis, what would it look like if we did 2 years of mandatory data retention? We're not completely wedded to a particular data set, but and we're certainly not ready to announce this to the public yet, but we do want to know whether it could be done, and if so, what it would cost and what the technical limitations would be. Somebody objecting to having found themselves in the situation where it needed to be confidential spoke to a journalist, and the story broke that, in fact, this proposal for quite indiscriminate collection and archival of material for everybody, whether you're suspected of particular criminal activity or not, was on the cards. And we were quite fortunate at the time, persuaded some coalition colleagues that a Senate inquiry into digital privacy might be a good idea, and effectively used that as a forum for bringing out into the daylight exactly what it was that was understudied. And it was met with quite a degree of hostility in the press, in the public debate. What the hell is this secret proposal for mass storage storage and retention of data, whether you're guilty, whether you're a person of interest or not. And the proposal kind of went away. That was under Attorney General Robert McClellan. In 2012, it broke again when Attorney General Nicola Roxon, to her credit, again under pressure from the same individuals within the Attorney General's Department, put it with a bunch of other material to the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. And the Greens don't have a seat on that. In fact, no crossbenchers do at the moment. But at the time, Andrew Wilkie did. He was the crossbench representation, if you like. And apart from that, it was a bit of an old boys club, and actually it really is at the moment. It's composed entirely of men from the major parties. There are no independent views on that committee, which is a shame, because I think it's actually degraded its ability to do quite an important job. Nonetheless, Attorney General Roxon, rather than having this debate basically going on in a subterranean way, put it to the committee. And again, there's one paragraph in this discussion paper canvassing a whole range of other national security options that says, oh, and by the way, 2 years mandatory data retention for every device, every man, woman, child in the country. How about it? The proposal was slammed. The committee couldn't come to a consensus view at the time. Sorry if this background's really boring, but I figure not everybody may know that this thing's had quite a long fuse. The committee was unable to come to a consensus view, consensus recommendations, and so it effectively threw it back to the government. Firstly, taking a pretty hefty swing at the AG's department, saying, you can't flip us a paragraph about that. You needed to tell us what exactly it was you wanted. And sort of dragging, like pulling teeth, more detail out of the department. What data sets? Why do you need it? Who will have access to it? How would it be accessed? Still very little detail put into the public domain, but nonetheless, the committee's report's in the public domain. You're all able to read it. You're probably sick of hearing about it, actually. Effectively said, if a government would choose to do this thing, then it should be surrounded by these safeguards, and there are all these other unanswered questions about purpose, motivation, and workability, whether it will actually do what you think it's going to do. So considering that it was effectively being a referral to a pretty friendly committee dominated by government MPs and senators, it was a remarkably hostile report that got handed down, which I don't think has necessarily been reflected in subsequent public debate. When Senator Brandis, our President Attorney General, jumps up and says this was canvassed at length by the Joint Committee in 2012 and 2013. Yeah, it was. And they kind of slammed it. They didn't come out and say that it's a great idea. They said, careful what you wish for. So those recommendations are on the public record. Now, Senator Brandis and I don't have a great deal of time for each other. I guess I could just make that clear at the outset. Probably not a really high level of mutual adoration and respect on either side. In my view, effectively, the Attorney General's Department has finally found an Attorney General weak enough to just proceed without any kind of critical thinking. Two previous Attorneys General, one smart enough to simply drop it, one smart enough to throw some transparency at it and put it to a committee, and the final one, Mark Dreyfus, who's currently the Shadow Attorney General, in the fairly brief tenure that he had before the change of government, had just said, no, not at this time. Maybe we'll go back to the drawing board and think about it. Now the department has somebody who's simply, uncritically, with, I would say, quite a tenuous grasp on the nature of the technology itself. And I don't come from a technical background, and recognising that a lot of you do. So I don't pretend to understand exactly how these systems work, but I spend quite a bit of time talking to people who do, and I wish our Attorney General would do the same. It will effectively just advance this agenda, and increasingly, alarmingly, it's actually been taken out of his hands after the Walkley Award-winning performance on Sky News last year. And it sort of, for a while, you'll notice, and I think it's quite significant, proposal was actually launched by Malcolm Turnbull as a communications initiative in the House of Reps. It didn't enter the world as a national security issue tabled by George Brandis. But since then, you'll see it's quite clearly migrated into the Prime Minister's office. And this is an individual who's actually staked his recovery, I would argue it's terminal, but that's a conversation for over a beer, on looking much, much tougher than the other guys on national security, to the point where they're actually quite seriously risking bipartisanship, in my view. And I use that term deliberately, it's not a word I use a lot, whereby Labor and Liberal stitch up agreements behind the scenes and then no criticism is tolerated. I think they've risked that, doing sneaky things like writing to the opposition leader demanding bipartisanship and then leaking that letter to the Australian newspaper and calling a press conference with the federal police off the back of it, to effectively, I think, threaten the opposition into passing these laws uncritically and in a bit of a hurry. So that's a very quick potted history of how we got to where we are. This is as furthest along as this has ever got. We've never had a bill before. There is a draft description of the data sets that we're seeking to capture. There is a report, or probably two reports, that have been undertaken into exactly how much this has cost. Neither of them have been made public, and I suspect nor will they. So we're certainly a lot further down the curve, and what is likely to happen, I'll come back to this at the end, the government's timetable, as the Prime Minister put it in a press conference about a fortnight ago, is by the end of March this will be law. So that's what we have to work with. As I said at the outset, and maybe I do have some strong but respectful disagreements with advocates, not at the political layer, because I actually am starting to despise how they're running the argument in the immensely cynical way in which it's being prosecuted. But I do respect the need for lawful investigations of corruption, serious criminal activity, and certainly protection of national security. But I think, and so very few people on any side of the debate disputes that basic premise, so it's kind of good to set that aside. We're mostly on the same page in that way. And also nobody really seriously disputes the importance of metadata for all three of those categories of investigation. The department, in a session about 3 weeks ago, put some statistics to us which show that on slightly less than 100% of investigations into important stuff, metadata plays some kind of role, just in effectively laying the groundwork, looking at who's suspect and who's not. That is almost, but not quite, ubiquitous. So that's, again, kind of our ground condition. Nobody disputes that telecommunications data is really important across the board. Where the dispute arises, to just be really clear about it, is the degree of discrimination and targeting that's involved. And in democracies, we make it quite difficult for a fairly small number of agencies to conduct targeted but extremely severe violations of individual privacy in order to protect the community. And one of the balancing points that democracies have arrived at to sustain that tension between the overwhelming power of the state to do everything over, to have extraordinary power over individual citizens, one of those points of balance is this process of judicial oversight, and what it looks like actually is documented as a warrant. That the investigating agency fills out an affidavit, which can be actually quite arduous depending on what it is that you're after, goes to the AAT or to a magistrate and says this is what we need, and in almost 100% of cases, because these agencies don't have the resources to fool around and do fishing expeditions, warrants are issued, and then individual citizens can have their privacy totally violated in the interests of public safety, anti-corruption, and all of those other things. And population of 23 million on people in Australia is about 5,000 of those warrants for stored communications and for intercepts of live communications, about 5,000 a year, which to me doesn't sound completely out of hand in a country as large as Australia. And you very rarely hear, in fact, I don't think there's anybody seriously on the law enforcement side of the debate, I'd be very surprised if the Assistant Commissioner did it this morning, argues to unwind that point of balance or those protections. I'm presuming, raise your hand if you did, he didn't say we want to abolish the warrant system because it's inconvenient and it's arduous and it impedes investigations. Did he say that?
No, he said the exact opposite, that it should be tough.
Right, it should be tough. It's not tough in North Korea. It's not tough in under the Chinese Communist Party. It's probably really easy in Iran. In Australia, it's tough for a bloody good reason. And very few, if ever, you will hear from the kind of pro-data retention side of the debate that they want to unwind that warranted protection or that point of balance. So again, that's not a dispute that we're having. They want to streamline it and actually have some sympathy for that. Like, you shouldn't necessarily have to table individual warrants and separate affidavits for different devices belonging to the same person. So there's some streamlining, and I think there's actually some room for quite useful discussion there. But I think that we would unwind that protection at our peril, and in fact, that's exactly what we've done. Stilgarian, you must have heard me run this spiel about 500 times. So if you leave the room, I won't be offended.
No, I suppose if you need to take a break.
You can just unfortunately, I keep saying that and it keeps happening, but nonetheless. if the state's got your phone, it's got your soul. And I think we actually have undermined that quite powerful and important protection that was set in place by people who probably understood the threats and risk of state tyranny a lot better than most of us here do today. In the fact that, yes, there are roughly 5,000 of these warrants applied for, but there are 580,000 metadata authorizations every year as reported to the ACMA. So 100-fold expansion of warrantless surveillance over people, which could be as stuff as simple as, like, the digital equivalent of opening the white pages. Who owns that handset? And I don't necessarily think you should need a warrant to read the white pages, however that looks in 2015. So some of that I think is legitimate, that basic identification of subscriber data. But as you in this community will be very well aware, metadata in aggregate is content, and it's massively invasive. It's actually more invasive than content, because you can lie over a mobile phone handset. You can speak in code, you can misdirect, but your metadata doesn't lie. You know, if your handset was in a, hands up if you use a mobile phone. It's a cheap laugh, isn't it? Unless you're a very, very sophisticated technical actor, it's very difficult to fool a cell tower. And if you were to do that, probably the only way you really doing is switching it off. So metadata doesn't lie. Your email records don't lie. And metadata in aggregate, as you'd be well aware, is not simply content, but it can map in a very, very fine grain of detail your entire life, your entire social network. There's some really interesting tools, including one I saw just this week, where you can feed your email account and password into this system that some researchers at MIT had set up, and it will basically go back and loot your entire email history, not the content, just the metadata, and make these immensely detailed, terrifyingly detailed little spiderweb diagrams of when your relationship broke up and when you got a new job and when these people came into your life. And then you start to overlay that with location data and whatever transaction data might end up sniffing through the net as well. In a warrantless basis, anybody from a local government authority all the way up to the AFP and ASIO can map your entire life without a warrant. So even if this, here's one fun scenario that I'll float just because it's fun. Imagine that the Prime Minister is toppled by a cohort of colleagues, 50% plus one who just can't stand it anymore, just want it to stop. It takes Brandis down with it unthinkable, because this is grown-up government, but just work with me on this.
So it's good government.
It's good government, it's grown-up, predictable, no surprises government. But imagine that that also takes down Senator Brandis and Prime Minister Turnbull, who hated the idea in 2012 and penned a far more articulate op-ed about it than I ever will, maybe quietly sends it back to the drawing board. So maybe that's going to happen, but actually probably it's not. Probably this is really upon us. Even if that were to happen, we still have a broken access regime. We have a broken authorization system where dozens of agencies, arguably hundreds, if you take local government authorities into the mix, which are using it, accessing this material without a warrant, and effectively just circumventing this, quite detailed and in my view quite robust process that nobody suggests we should unpick. It's been completely circumvented by the march of technology, and the fact that this material is a lot more valuable than content, and it's a lot easier to get in aggregate. That's the problem that we have. That's why you'll see right from the conservative end of the spectrum all the way through to the libertarians and the pirates and the FA and us and all the others saying, get a warrant, not to read the white pages, but to map my entire life and my entire social network without my consent. Get a damn warrant. If it's okay to have to get a warrant to listen in on a single phone call, then to effectively track your entire life should require a warrant as well. Surprisingly enough, there's no requirement for such a thing in the bill that's before the Parliament at the moment. One of the things that we have been trying to do, I guess since 2008 when this thing first sprang out, is find some evidence as to whether it's useful, as to actually whether it fulfills the function, because we are dicing with some quite important premises of democracy here. Maybe if it actually does keep us safer, or think of the children, or think of the way ICAC uses this material, if it actually makes us safer and improves society, maybe these freedoms we should in fact give up. So we've been looking for evidence rather than anecdotes as to, in regimes where it exists, has it helped? And I've actually lost track of the number of times that I've asked the Attorney General's Department, just show us evidence, because the evidence that we see from President Obama's investigation in the United States, the German experience or other European regimes where they had a data retention scheme until it was effectively frozen out, wound back by the Human Rights Court in Europe. Show us the data, particularly for a place like Germany where there's before and after. You had a data retention regime for more than a year. Did it improve crime clearance rates? Or President Obama's study, did it actually prevent any terror attacks? And if there's evidence out there, I'd love to see it because nobody has been able to present it to us thus far. That should really be the last nail. Dicing with something as important and obtrusive as this, you'd want a pretty strong evidence base to be bouncing off, but instead we just get the same boring and, to my mind, actually quite offensive slogans by an increasingly shrill-sounding Prime Minister who figures the only way he's going to stay in his job is if he can just terrify us into putting up with him for another couple of years. I don't think it's good enough. On the 27th of Feb, which is this coming Friday, the Parliamentary Joint Committee will table its report, and at that point the Labor Party is going to need to put some cards on the table. There have been some indications they're worried about effects on whistleblowers, so am I, about journalists, so am I, about the fact that the definition of metadata is not in the bill, which means the scope can be widened on a whim by regulation without having to come through Parliament. Pretty worried about that too. But you can see Labor doing what it quite frequently does, which is send a few good-hearted, decent people out to make strong statements and then cave in and vote for the bill while waving their fingers and saying this is really bad. That is the setup. But their asking price is starting to become a little bit clearer. My prediction is it'll be a bit clearer again on the 27th when that report gets tabled. They really like unanimous reports. I think it's almost unprecedented that you would get a breakout minority report where Labor says this is a piece of shit, we shouldn't do it. Very, very unlikely that that would happen. On the 18th of March, a committee process that I've been chairing since December 2013 into the if not this, then what? So what would a fit-for-purpose 21st century telecommunications interception regime look like? These are good questions, and I don't want to be the guy standing up here saying no data retention without having some good proposals on the table for what we should do instead. So on the 18th, you'll see more than a year's worth of work tabled from that committee, which may well splinter into a series of minority reports and disagreements. But either way, there'll be some views put on behalf of your parliamentarians as to what we think should happen instead to kind of strike that appropriate balance between community safety and privacy. So what if this thing actually costs more than $400 million to implement, and that I guess is just in the startup year, which will be more expensive as people are getting their back-end systems up and running. IINet released an infographic last week where I had to read a couple of times because they're predicting one new data centre is going to be required per month. $400 million. That it's going to send apparently half of the small end of the ISP world to the wall because they're just not going to be able to compete with behemoths like Telstra, who are going to have their hand out for some of that $400 million, but actually have the engineering clout back end to probably weave things together more effectively than the little startups. And this was meant to be the government of deregulation taking pressure off business. And there's been years of deregulation, some of it actually pretty smart in the telecommunications sector to try and, particularly at the retail end of things, to try and create this innovation and this competitive tension and competitive playing field. And it looks like they're about to wipe it out for the sake of a tough sounding press conference. And it'll create this brand new archive to be mined and looted, and goodness knows what ends up happening to that material. Again, IINet, when Steve Dobby was there, told a session in Parliament House, not necessarily IINet or Telstra probably, but at the small end of town, you're just being forced to store tons and tons of this material. It's not going to be against the law to just engage a cheap cloud provider out of China to just host that stuff that you'd rather not be keeping in the first place. Who the hell is going to look after that? Is it going to be protected to the same degree of security as credit cards are? Probably not. And we have had a series of really vivid examples of what happens when people lose control of big personal important data sets. So what kind of lessons do we still need to learn? So there are 10 Greens who are going to vote against this bill if it comes to the floor of the Senate. There are 3 or 4 crossbenchers who are going to vote against it, which means we're 25 short. That happens to be the exact number of Labor senators who sit in that place. Again, at this point, we might part company and you say, Greenies, just get out of the way and let them do their job. we are going to vote against it, and I'm kind of hoping the Labor Party will as well, either to raise the bar on amendments to provide protections. Maybe they get a 3-month data retention regime. Maybe you need a warrant for metadata and aggregate of certain kinds of invasive material. Maybe we can protect journalists and whistleblowers from having their phone records saluted to find out who's talking to who. That story is about to be told. But I'd like to know what your thoughts are, and mostly it'd be inappropriate for me to get down on my knees and beg, but I would ask you, particularly if you write on this subject, to not simply uncritically, as some in the mainstream media are doing, swallow the line that law enforcement will cease to exist unless data retention is brought into play. And that's being written up in mainstream newspapers. Please don't do that. I'm happy to have our arguments tested and have a pretty critical look at as well, because they will help me improve my arguments if you're doing that. But please don't let Attorney General George Brandis and Prime Minister Tony Abbott drag us into, in my mind, further down the pipe of a surveillance dystopia where it's very, very difficult to contest this stuff if it ends up in the wrong hands. I don't believe Australia is a fascist state, I really don't. But these protections between the entitlements and the lives and the rights of citizens against the overwhelming power of the state have been built up over centuries, and you don't bowl those over casually for the sake of failing poll numbers and an unstable backbench. So, the one thing I guess we don't want to see happen is what happened with the passage of the ASIO bill last year, where you can be criminalised for 5 to 10 years as a journalist for disclosing a certain category of ASIO investigation. I could be prosecuted for sharing that story on Facebook. And that passed. The Labor Party made forbidding sounding noises and then voted for it. And then there was this remarkable outpouring from the press gallery in the Parliament in the aftermath of people going, well, that was really bad, what we just did then. And I would hate to see that happen with this bill. We have a couple of precious weeks in which to either turn the temperature up and make sure it's a better bill that passes, or it would be my strong preference to have it sent back to the drawing board where it started. Probably used up 25, maybe even more. Thanks very much for your attention.
Senator Ludlam, Richard Churchill in the Register. Let's start by trying to define where the line sits in your mind. I guess to speak with the voice of law enforcement for a moment. We got a phone call from somebody. Somebody got a phone call from somebody. They're in trouble down behind the Fairmont Resort. We need the cell dump now so we can get some idea of where the person might be. That is an awfully long way from trolling to catch journalists. Where between one end and the other do you see? Can you discern where the line should be drawn?
The cell dump idea, maybe this is going to get me in trouble, but that doesn't bug me if it's urgent, and if they're looking for a haystack, for a needle in a haystack's about to disappear, then grab it. Similarly, the regime that we instituted, I think in about 2012, for data preservation notices, that does data retention narrowcast. It says, for these persons of interest until we tell you to stop, please trap and store everything, don't throw anything away. And then you conclude your investigation or you prosecute people. But again, those two examples don't inadvertently drag the entire civilian population into the net. So I guess this is partly exactly the questions we're grappling with in this Telecommunications and Deception and Access Act inquiry, is where that line should be drawn in something as stodgy and clumsy as the law, given how rapidly technology is evolving. That's always going to be tricky. And different people will come to different views. To my mind, where I'm going to continue to turn my attention is targeted and discriminate, because that's what democracies have been trying to do, I guess, since the interception of the postal system.
In the presentation earlier by Tim Morris, he characterised the legislation as proposed as representing no new powers or access. And he said it was kind of trying to standardise the way that metadata is kept and how long it's kept. Is that actually correct?
I think it's partly correct. He didn't stand here and lie to your faces, I'm presuming. The no new powers thing is interesting, but only if you're comfortable with our broken access regime. So it doesn't, in fact, one of the things that the government's probably not had enough credit for is they are proposing to narrow the range of agencies who can access this material. So in a sense, they are actually narrowing the pipe through the stuff that can be got, with one very important caveat, which is that agencies will be able to queue up and get special dispensation to get it anyway. But at least that's one thing. But no new powers kind of doesn't leave me very impressed when you think about the 580,000 authorisations that are just routinely rubber stamped every year under existing powers.
Well, he categorised that as being less than 1/10 of 1%. Was it 0.014 with all the data or something?
Of what?
Of the 560,000 requests that they make per year in 2014.
So the AFP was making 0.14?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, right, so let's have...
That's not.
I should have been here, I'm sorry. I've had to fly in from
He
Perth
says
this morning.
42 million, I think, connected devices in Australia,
Oh,
and
no, right,
they
get
hit
stuffed.
They hit 50,000 a year, so that's not much.
Sorry, yeah, get stuff.
Can we vote on that?
That's a room full of journalists.
Sorry, I called it a piece of shit already.
How many of you have already tweeted that? No, I don't think that is very fair. You know, if you detonated 0.14% of Australians' houses, there'd be a riot. So it's a small percentage of something really important. These are still people having their records taken without their consent. And you know, the AFP, I forget exactly what the percentage is, but it is relatively small. Actually, it's Centrelink is a huge wedge of the pie chart accessing people's records. They're not a national security agency. How come they can do that without a warrant when the AFP actually does have to go through this arduous process of paperwork and stuff to get people's content records? I think things are wildly out of balance, and I guess what I'm reminded of is the mining company that comes along and says we're going to obliterate 0.14% of this national park, and you know, the rest of it's going to be peachy. It doesn't really cut it. Please don't quote me on the get stuff thing. That sounds really disrespectful.
You must speak to the colleagues on the AFP frequently on this. Sorry, you must speak to the colleagues from the AFP frequently on this.
Yeah.
How confident are you that they have across conditions and threats and will vote accordingly? They seem to have given the political support to discussing with them quickly.
Yeah. I don't. Look, they've got no reason not to be. Mr. Dreyfus was Shadow Attorney General, so he knows the stuff inside out. I think Jason Clare's doing a pretty good job as Shadow Communications Minister and seems to know his way around the sector as well. And they substituted themselves onto the PJCIS, so they've had a better opportunity than me actually, because they've had access to the evidence that was given under the table in camera by some of the security agencies. So I don't doubt technical competence, if you like. I'm much more worried about the politics of it. If I thought this was a debate that was going to proceed on policy merit alone, it would have already finished. It's much more politics. It's standing up next to Andrew Colvin, big fit guy in a uniform and an AFP banner, looking as tough as hell. It's cheaper than going to Iraq and standing next to the troops, and forgive my cynicism, but I'm much more distressed by the way that politicians are playing it than by the agencies. They're trying to do a tricky job, and it's our job to kind of balance those powers out. But of course, they want more surveillance powers. They want to be able to do stuff faster. I'm much more upset by the way the politicians are managing themselves, and unfortunately, that's what the ALP are responding to. We're lucky that we have an incompetent Attorney General and a total bully as a Prime Minister who continually punches people in the face who he's going to later need as allies. We're lucky that they're not smarter and better at their jobs than they are. Quote me on that. Done. Yeah. I'm going to regret this.
You've mentioned competence
Go ahead.
a couple of times so far.
I mentioned what, sorry?
You've mentioned competence a couple of times so far, and during the earlier session, I raised the question of competence with the Assistant Commissioner, and he correctly said, of course, that that's not his job.
The politics, you mean?
Competence of the people developing and maintaining the systems that manage this data.
Yeah.
I have very little confidence in the competence of these people, and I'm getting the feeling that you have a similar sort of fear.
Look, I think they know the agencies themselves have a much better, the people who actually are operationalising this stuff have a much better idea of the technology than the politicians do, because they are querying these databases. They're feeding forms in, and then the telcos have to come back and say that's hard or that's easy or whatever. So I don't doubt that they have that basic level of technical competence, but also I think it really caught them by surprise when the sector came back and said, do you realise that's petabytes of data? That's a new data centre every month. And I'm happy if anybody wants to validate that number, because that nearly made my head fall off. Does that sound realistic? That's a lot of material. I think it just surprised them, because what they want is for things to be simple. Of course, if you're doing this tricky job, you would want all of the data all of the time that was evident, you know, of the ability to be able to just use as evidence. It was all networks, you could cross-reference everything. And the sector's as messy and broken and kind of balkanised as hell. So I suspect they didn't realise that what sounded simple when you say it quickly was going to be messy and really expensive. These are very distinct from the debates around democracy and whether we should do it.
Well, part of what was said earlier was that the AFP do not have one simple or single database of the data that they refer to. And some of us were discussing this at the break a few minutes ago, had the feeling that he didn't really have the technical understanding of just what a database really is,
sure,
and just how fragile this data is. And most of this data is going to be stored, let's face it, we're talking log files, we're talking flat text files that if somebody gets access to them, anybody can just read them, because this is not going to be encrypted data.
Yeah.
My question was following from what you were saying about if you have any more information about just how this information would be stored, should we still be parsed?
Well, the bill doesn't say. The bill was written by lawyers inside the Attorney General's Department. They don't have a technical background. It's one of the reasons this thing's been pending since 2008, and we still don't have a settled definition of the data set that they want.
I've got a USB stick they can use.
Yeah.
I have a USB stick they can use.
I don't think we should pursue that line of argument any further.
Adam Turner, freelancer with Sydney Morning Herald. We've seen the draft for the crackdown on piracy and how they want to identify IP addresses and then go to the internet service provider.
Yeah.
Does that mean that even if none of what we're talking about gets up, that there will still need to be some kind of data retention for that system to work, because they will need to then start keeping everybody's IP address for a certain amount of time for that system to work?
I'm not calling a skeptic, but I think that's mostly what this is about. Colvin gave it away at the very first press conference, and then Turnbull had to jump in and try and muddy the waters up a little bit. And I think we've been a bit hung up on the idea that it would be the feds prosecuting you for file sharing, which isn't a thing at the moment. It could well be, like God knows what's in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, maybe that's where this debate's going, but actually what it does is open the door to precisely the kind of behaviour that you're on about. And now we're seeing with the Dallas Buyers Club thing, with IINet, the kind of template for how this behaviour will work, where they're trying to streamline that process so you don't have to go through court every time you want these logs of who held which IP address for what period of time. It just becomes a matter of routine. So wouldn't data retention be really exquisitely useful for that kind of thing?
But at the moment, not necessarily every ISP is keeping the IP information that's going to be needed for that.
So why don't we write a bill to force them to store it and tell people that if we don't do that, law enforcement will cease to exist and the terrorists will win? Sorry, it's breathtakingly cynical what's going on.
Chris with the Australian, is that the case that data can actually be stored offshore, and would you be insisting that it isn't stored here on the Australian, if it is stored?
Look, there's probably folk in the room who would be better informed on this than me. I don't see anything in the bill that says you have to host all of this material onshore. I don't think it's there. It's different.
There's nothing in the bill that Privacy Act requires any personal data, private data, and things like this would counter that for reasonable, appropriate steps. Well, Tim Pilgrim thinks it does, the Privacy Commission.
That everything under this act would need to be stored onshore?
We haven't seen what everything entails.
Yes. Yeah.
But certainly things like customer records and who owns which IP address and which phone number and things is very clear on that. But again, the sense of what counts as taking reasonable steps to protect things under the same. So it's got to be kept under the same standards that we would require in Australia.
Yeah, which is pretty damn hard to enforce. One of the unfortunate things that fell over at the end of the last parliament was mandatory data breach notifications. So There's a couple of Labor senators have applied a senator's bill in on that, and it was quite close to passing with cross-party support, and it lapsed. But at least then you would be required to be notified of stuff that had walked out the door. But it's an excellent question, and unfortunately that's going to split some incentives within the industry if it's so, because then we'll have people who build data centers coming out and saying the more data we store, the better. This is fantastic. Whereas at the moment it's more opposition being driven from the ISPs who are going to be the ones paying for it.
Actually, my question was related to that, in the sense that can we have a debate about mandatory data retention when we actually don't have a mandatory data breach notification regime in place?
Well, I think one would want to accompany the other. If you're going to insist on driving this thing through and implementing it, I think you would need data breach notification laws, and at the very minimum, you would need to tighten the access regime so that certain categories of metadata went into the warranted regime. Also narrow the range of agencies that can get a hold of it in the first place. I suspect then you would see the 580,000 number would drop quite sharply as a lot of fluffy stuff disappeared. I don't know if this is a controversial view, but I don't think basic subscriber information should require a warrant. I think that is onerous, and it's never really been the case to date. But nobody's really been able to tell us, and maybe nobody knows, how much of the 580,000 are just simple subscriber requests and how much of it is for this more exotic, really intensive data mining stuff. The records that were given under the TIA Act don't tell us.
On the subject of cost, I mean, regardless of the actual amount that it turns out to be, any thoughts on how the cost should be allocated? For example, why should the ISP be picking up any part of this? If it's essential for public safety and national security, shouldn't it be completely funded from taxation?
Your taxes and mine.
Yeah. If it's going to be done. I'm not saying whether it should or should, but if it is done, should.
No, I don't feel like I've got a strong view on that either way. I don't actually want any of my taxes going into paying for a surveillance regime that I'm opposing every minute that I'm awake. But then it's either that or Telstra's going to hike my data charges, so they've got us coming and going for me. Yeah, I don't want to come out here and advocate for a 60-40 split. Don't do that.
So it's more important 60.
Don't do that either. But can you see where I'm coming from, right? It's like we're all going to pay for it.
That's why I said it. That's the game you get into.
There's one argument that says actually it should all come through data charges from your ISPs, because then at least people who don't use telecommunication services aren't paying for the surveillance of those who do. I don't know, is that a sustainable argument?
It's not the one we use with the fire brigade. So certainly in Victoria, we've recently shifted funding from fire brigades from a levy on people with house insurance to
everybody.
Well, not those, to property owners. Right.
It's kind of diabolical, and the thing, if you just want to look at it from an industry perspective, my argument would be, Telstra, Optus, they've got bigger systems that are more complicated, and they've probably got a much more complex back-end task in front of them, but they're going to be much more likely to A, be able to lobby for a bigger slice of that public handout, and B, more able to probably absorb some of those costs, which is what I think is being argued is going to clean up a lot of the smaller emerging players. So it's kind of a wicked question.
Paul, freelance. Just, do you think the Prime Minister is going to get his wish on getting the sack by the end of March?
Oh man, if I do that.
Getting the sack too.
That's everybody else's wish.
Sorry.
Look, honestly, I don't know. If I knew that, I'm not sure what I'd do. If I knew we were going to win, exactly.
Your feeling on how this is playing out?
My feeling is that I've been in this situation a reasonable number of times where the Labor Party are just too scared to take a strong stand, and they'll think that they're going to be made to look soft on national security. But I feel as though it's still in the balance. To be honest, I genuinely don't know. Let's do a quick show of hands and a quick poll. Who thinks this sucker is going to pass by the end of March? The legislation will pass by the end of March, will be law, national data retention regime. Put your hands right up. Who thinks that it's something else is going to happen and it won't pass for some reason or other?
Can I say
by the end of March?
Kind of nominating competence.
Yeah. That'd be wonderful, wouldn't it? So the
Can I
room is
just say that
50,
we really need to
split.
know what Mr. Abbott says tomorrow in Parliament, because that's tomorrow.
As a campaigner and an advocate, I can't count on them internally self-combusting and it falling over. I'm operating on the worst case scenario, which is Labor blinks. I'm just basically going on the template of what happened last year with the ASIO bill, and then you get these weird expressions of regret post-fact, that they will come up with some kind of hack together compromise behind the scenes that'll give Labor enough to wave around. They'll duck the cover a little bit to say we improved it and we protected some rights, and that's
So, Senator, are you saying that if Labor, as you said on the 27th, shows its hand and says we can give conditional support to this law provided there's certain amendments made to it and changes, something that some of the stuff that you mentioned, that would be the scope of the data retention, protection for journalists. If Labor comes up with that candidate, would the Greens support Labor in that sort of position?
No. We'd support the amendments, right? Like if there are amendments to improve a bill that we're going to vote against, well, unfortunately we're put in that position reasonably frequently. Of course, I'm not going to leave the room in a huff and not vote for amendments that could have tightened up protections around it. So yeah, we will be doing that if necessary, but we won't be supporting the bill. And even if our kind of best case amendment scenario comes through, say we get a 3-month data retention period, which is actually a period of time where most of the crimes that are solved using this kind of material are 3 months older or less. The 2-year thing is a weird, arbitrary kind of date. Say you get 3 months, say you get warranted provisions brought in, that would be a real improvement in public policy. It's going to be a damn hard line to draw, but it would be a big improvement. If Labor doesn't draft that amendment, we certainly will be. And you get a few other protections. Maybe you get a public interest monitor like exists in Victoria or Queensland, who can be intervening at the warranting stage saying, do you need that? Does it need to be for 3 months? Do you need 100 of them, or could you do with, it kind of narrows the scope a bit behind the scenes. So imagine if we got this entire, a couple of quite good amendments, but that we still had a national data retention scheme in place in this country. In 6 months' time, the next time something horrible happens somewhere, they're going to say, you know what, actually we're going to need web records. Actually we're going to need 5 years. Actually we're going to need this and we're going to need that. And what I've noticed in my brief time working in this space is that these things move in one direction only. It's bloody hard to unwind them once they're in. But it's a process of continual, almost by definition, scope creep. And I don't actually lay this at the feet of the agencies because they're just trying to do their job. But the politicians, every time something horrible happens, this is partly our fault, as the members of the general public, thump the table and demand that something be done. And data retention is something. So we're going to do it. It's a thing that we could be seen to be doing something. That's the risk.
In recent years, do you see journalism becoming an extension of politics?
In recent years? No, I reckon that's been since the dawn of time. Read some of the amazing stuff in the early few chapters of the Finkelstein Review. They're talking about the state of play, the tension and the relationship between capital, politics, and journalism in the early years of the 20th century in the United States. They'll make your hair stand on end because it feels like it was written yesterday. None of this is particularly new. But nonetheless, still, no matter how degraded and concentrated it is, there's still some really, really good national security journalists operating in this country. You could just about name them on one hand, but they're still doing the work. And actually, you can tell when it is operating as intended. It's still a tremendously important feedback process for keeping people honest. But I don't think that there's anything particularly new. There's the restructuring of the market, there's the fragmentation, but I don't know how many people in here actually write for a living, working as journalists, freelance, or for a particular channel. And keep your hand up if you're, one or two said Fairfax, so keep your hand up if it's Fairfax News Corp or the ABC. All right, so well over half of the people who put their hands up are working presumably as freelancing or independents or for kind of niche publications. So there's a lot of vibrancy around, and actually the tech press, I think, is what has kept things like the net filter and the first 2 iterations of data retention a bit off the table because then journalists who are less specialised can read what the technical community is saying to itself and go, well, a lot of people are pissed off about this thing. Maybe there's a story here. So, yeah, come on.
You're guilty about thinking the limiter or fair.
Oh, come on.
With that, we'll go with David.
Next question.
David Swan from the Spectator. Just going back to your answer before, which I understand is that you wouldn't spot a deal with any amendment from Labor. Could that lead potentially to an ETS carbon tax scenario where you get something put in front of you and on principle you reject it, but then you end up with something much worse?
No, I think it's really different because in a sense, you got Labor and the coalition voting as a bloc. So then I'm reduced to either providing commentary or trying to bring amendments in to tilt the table in one direction or another. But so that scenario doesn't arise. If Labor and the coalition vote together, then the cross benches, there's 18 of us. So our view won't prevail. The situation that you might be referring to, and that was exactly the right thing to do to vote down the ETS, by the way, but that is another conversation to have, only arises when Labor, when we're in balance of power effectively, when Labor's on the other side of the equation, which could still happen. Like, it's entirely possible that it could happen. I think, to give them their due, Labor spokes, there's huge unrest and disquiet inside the Labor caucus over this. I know that for a fact, including, fairly senior people, and a small but quite important core of dissent within the Liberal Party as well. None of the Nationals that I know of. But if it's a case of Labor opposing and the Greens opposing, then it sinks. If they come back with something more venomous later, we'll fight it later. I guess that's politics.
Just a detail on things that could happen to Bill, and I know your power is limited, 18 votes, etc.
Well, we're only 10.
No, sorry,
I can't speak for the rest of the crossbench, but
is limited. But would you also like to see a destruction mandate in the bill or the reg somewhere so that an agency with data does not have that data forever, and that limits the ability of crook cops to do bad things with data they've already taken?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And that's come up, and I think some of you guys have written that up, that there's no obligation, this came out of an estimates or two ago, I think, there's no obligation on agencies to destroy this material. So if you are assembling these huge kind of warehouses full of material and just keep accessing more and more and more, then you can build up incredibly complex pictures. And where this really starts to worry me is, if it's an organised crime network you're following, then knock yourself out. I mean, that's how these tools should be deployed. If it's Friends of the Earth or Sea Shepherd or Land Rights campaigns, then we crossed a line, and to be quite honest, I think we have. That's when it gets very dangerous. Or if it's, handing off names and articles to the AFP of people who are covering our concentration camps on Manus and Christmas Island. Who did that journalist talk to? Who is their source? That's pretty scary stuff that's happening now.
Just going back to the bill itself and whether it will sink or swim, you're relying obviously a lot on Labor, and in their time in opposition they've rarely missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity.
I wish I'd thought of that.
What do you think the chances are? Even with this dissent that you speak about within the ranks,
I can't give you odds. Like, I honestly don't know. If I thought it was lost, I don't know if I'd be standing here wasting time. Or we would be probably having a more interesting discussion about amendments and how could it be improved and circumscribed and detailed. I honestly don't know what they're going to do. My instinct is they're going to vote for it, and it'll be a question of how high is the political temperature that kind of forces them to seek amendments that are meaningful and have teeth. And I don't want to give you the wrong impression, like I said, I'm not going to throw my toys out of the cot and not vote for good amendments. We'll vote for them. If they're not there, we will write them ourselves, and sometimes you can get them up. But my instinct is Labor will vote for this bill, and it's kind of, I guess, my job and those of the various groups we've been working with in the next 3 or 4 weeks to persuade them that would be a really bad idea. And then if we're doing that persuasion well, you'll write it up and the articles will be amazing and use the people with them.
Isn't the hip pocket argument
That's why I've been saying and enunciating very clearly surveillance tax every time somebody puts me in front of a mic. But
You left the words big U out.
okay, yeah, it seems that's kind of a cheap shot, isn't it? I think in front of an audience like this, I didn't labour that point, because imagine if it was a really worthwhile community safety endeavour that would help solve huge amounts of crime and keep us safe forever. It'd be worth $400 million. If it was a good thing, you wouldn't run arguments solely on cost, right? Like the hospital system's really expensive to run, costs us a fortune. So I don't, it probably is, and I do use that argument a great deal, but for me it still feels a bit subsidiary to the fact that this is a really terrible idea. If it was free, it would still be a terrible idea.
Right. Yeah.
That's an interesting comment you just made, that if it was a good idea, they wouldn't run the argument.
That was me.
Yes, on cost. Let's go back to the NBN, where it was exactly that argument that was being run by the government.
If we start on NBN, I'm going to burst in tears in front of you, and that is all you'll write up. So, isn't that a sad thing that just happened?
Let's do a bit of a horror scenario. Tony Abbott, George Brandis, Malcolm Turnbull. Shag, kill, or marry.
What did you say?
I cannot believe you went there. Behave yourselves. Next question.
I'm sorry to like, I don't want to cry, but I was just wondering if you did have any information on information storage at the NBN at the moment as a reflection of how that might be conducted should the current government keep going.
You mean as relates to data retention, or just an NBN standalone question?
I mean, we all know under Labor that the way that information was stored within the system was deeply flawed, hugely expensive, and didn't make a lot of sense. But we haven't really heard a lot about what's happened to data management systems since the government has taken power.
Okay. No, I probably haven't got anything all that perceptive to put to you. It's probably a really good line of inquiry for estimates. I think it's likely to be a lot more fragmented because you've got a multitude of technology types that can offer different, will only be able to offer different levels of service provision depending on what kind of catchment you're in. Whether you're using, whether you know, like right at the end of a copper node, or whether you're on HFC or whatever. So I think actually the back-end stuff's going to be quite a lot more complicated and difficult than it would have been before, but I'm probably the wrong person to ask. There's probably technical people in here that could do a better job. I haven't heard anything recently. Yeah.
Similar to saying that that means to say that the population wouldn't be under surveillance because they're not interested in finding out what we're doing. They only act on criminal investigations. So they either have to have a tip-off or they have to be working on something.
Sure.
Yet, they're meant to be preventing terrorism. And if they don't use big data analytics, they're probably missing a big potential. Do you believe that when he says we will never do that, that is unlawful, will continue to be unlawful on any potential?
Oh, look, up to a point, yes. So I think there's a certain element of that argument that should just be treated as legitimate. Same goes for ASIO and the rest of the spooks community. They operate on what they perceive as very tight budgets. They don't have tens of thousands of staff, and when things go wrong, they lose their jobs and they get blamed for stuff. So they do tend to, I suspect, be as forensic and targeted as they can. They don't necessarily have time to be trawling all of our records. But, so two problems arise from that. One is they're not perfect, and what's unfolding in New South Wales at the moment with this internal surveillance encounter, surveillance scandal is remarkable that that's happening at the same time as this. These people are flawed and they're human, and so the technology can be abused, and there's examples of that from all over. But I guess the second counterpoint to that is, well, it's all very well for the AFP, but you've dragged Centrelink and the Victorian Taxi Directorate and the RSPCA and 500 local councils along with you. God knows what the NSA and ASD are up to using this technology. So yeah, making an argument is perfectly rational from the point of an AFP commissioner. I kind of get that, but actually we have to balance this out with a much bigger field of what's going on and who else has access to this material, lawful and unlawful.
In regards to that, do we have any information about how information sharing with our sovereign partners would work? Like, can the NSA, which has a much broader scope of inquiry, make
That's a conversation that I think is a lot bigger than data retention. Who's had time to see Citizen 4 so far? Not that many. Please see it. It's might be a good film recommendations, but I'm gonna. So it's the 8 days of footage that Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald got with Edward Snowden in the hotel room in Hong Kong before he disappeared to Moscow. And it's not the kind of sort of inconvenient truth, grand manifesto of surveillance, but it's a very personal story that does give you some insight into how invasive these tools can be. But I would put to you that citizens of the United States, apart from being protected to a measure by their own Bill of Rights, which we're not, know a lot more about the capabilities and individual programs of the NSA and its partners than we do here in Australia, because all we've been able to get out of George Brandis is Ed Snowden is a traitor. So we know next to nothing about the data sharing protocols and how ubiquitous or how constrained, or we know almost nothing about how that operates because they simply refuse to say anything at all. There's an interview with Laura Poitras that ran, I think it ran on The Guardian about 10 days ago, where she says there's going to be quite a bit more on Australia in coming months. Watch this space. Because when you think about it, it's blown up in a big way in the US. Brits know a lot about what GCHQ is up to. The debate's in a very different place in New Zealand because of the whole Kim.com thing. And poor old Australia, we're just kind of sleepwalking along with a guy who says Ed Snowden's a traitor, and that's the end of the conversation. We actually don't know that much.
All right, we'll make this a very last question.
Thanks. Following on from Leah's question before about ASIO and AFP, but ASIO and AFP got quite different scope of operations in terms of one effectively is investigating criminal acts and the other is a spy agent for all intents and purposes. But yet we're trying to generate a single piece of legislation which caters to some quite different needs. I think that is that part of the problem with this legislation, is that by mass storing all this data, we've got data that can be used for mass surveillance if ASIO decide they want to go trawling and looking for bad guys because they're bored one afternoon or whatever, versus the AFP who's launching an investigation based on a criminal, the expectation that a criminal act has been performed.
Yeah.
Is that part of the challenge in trying to balance all this?
I think it's more of a challenge of the access regime. To me, that feels like less of a technology challenge and more of a law and policy challenge in a way. So what the bill's trying to do is be technologically neutral, which is sensible because it obviously creates its own problems, and neutral to the question that you just asked. So it says we're going to store everything, and then anybody with a legitimate need to access it can access it. So I've got, which I went into in a little bit of detail, much bigger issues with the access regime, whether we get data retention in place here or not. Whereby, and cast your net a bit wider than AFP and ASIO, whether a storage system that can be used to effectively surveil the whole population in real time should be accessible on an equal basis to ASIO as it is to Australia Post or Centrelink. That's an access problem as well as a technology problem.
Okay. Can we thank Scott? So just from our point of view with logistics for the conference, we have pre-dinner drinks downstairs again in the foyer. We'll be back in the room we were in for the main